Alrighty, I see we have started going live, and we always like to give folks just a little bit of time here to join this kind of awkward pause area as we are getting going today with TMF Career Week, which I'm really excited about. So usually I try to fill in with some, chit chat right here early on a Monday morning as people are joining as the broadcast is going live. So excited to welcome everyone. I think I've done enough of the little pleasantries here, and folks are joining us. So welcome everyone to our second annual Career Week hosted by LMK. We're excited to be back and continue the conversation around what being a TMF professional is. I will be your facilitator for the week, Ben Rogers, Senior Manager of Education at LMK, and I'll be joined by various colleagues throughout the week to discuss various elements of what being a TMF professional is, the competencies. That's going to be our framework for today of being a TMF professional. But we have a lot of great content. We want to be the industry leader in really growing TMF professionals and letting people know that the TMF can be a career. When I started, I think we've seen drastic changes from 14 years ago of what being a TMF professional truly is. So we're excited to have this week dedicated to TMF professionals. And maybe you're not a TMF professional, but you're curious. You want to know what's being talked about in the TMF space. We certainly welcome you as well. Or you're somebody who's maybe looking to get into the industry and you've heard about this TMF word, this concept, but don't really know what it is and want to know more. That's why we're going to be here this week. So in our time together throughout the week, if you're joining multiple sessions, we will certainly have opportunities for you to engage with us and ask us questions. That's one of the things that we love and why we participate in these events, is to give you all the opportunity to engage with us. So if you do have any comments, questions, things that you want to ask, want us to talk about throughout Career Week, please put those in. We'll try to address as many as possible, depending on the amount that come in. Sometimes we get a few and sometimes we get a dozen or so. So we want to get to as much as possible and really make this engaging for you all. All right, I've been yapping for a minute or two here. I do want to let the two individuals that have joined me today to talk about what it means to be competent as a TMF professional introduce themselves. So Jen, I'll kick it off with you and let you introduce yourself and let the crowd know who you are.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Langelier. Good morning, Ben and Misty. I am currently a TMF senior TMF functional line manager here at LMK. I did start with LMK as a TMF support analyst. I then became a project manager, and now I'm a functional line manager. I've been in the TMF industry for about 18 years and about 22 in the clinical area. So I'm excited to talk to you all about some of the fundamentals today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen. What about you, Misty? Do you want to introduce yourself to the crowd?
Sure. My name is Misty Mathis. I'm a TMF support analyst. I actually have less than a year with LMK, but about 14 years in the industry, most of that in the TMF world. I started my career with Ben at the same time at the same company. And most of my career has been focused on the TMF space. I did spend a little time in other areas, and that helped me grow. But I came back to TMF because it's what I really love.
Yeah, we can be honest, Misty. I always joke that we are gluttons for punishment just because the TMF is that space that's often ignored by people. But we all kind of find our way back. We have all three made careers out of the TMF space, and all three have kind of very different careers, which is quite interesting. I do want to kind of start the conversation today a little bit more lighthearted and maybe not dive into competencies right away. And I'm going to probably ask this question of everyone this week, about being a TMF professional or being in a TMF space. What's something that you take pride in, you enjoy, you like about it? It keeps you in the space, right? Because I think we've said between 18, Misty, I think you and I are about around 14 years each. What's kept you in this space? Because I think for a long time it was looked at as that like stepping stone. And Misty, you kind of mentioned you did step away and you've come back. So for the two of you, and maybe Misty, I'll let you answer this one first since I'm going to ask you both here. What do you enjoy about being a TMF professional?
Well, I am someone who really likes structure. And so the TMF is a structure. And it's, if you do it right, it's a great one. And so I became really passionate about it being done right. And then when there are issues and stuff, for me, it feels very much like solving a puzzle. You know, you have to find the answer and then put it all back together the way it goes, or what have you. And I really like puzzles. So
I love it. Yeah, put things together. What about you, Jen? What do you think? What's kind of your favorite thing?
I think it's kind of similar. I really like the, just the hierarchy and following the organization, but I also like enjoy, like Misty said, I kind of like the investigative side and really digging in, like, especially when you can't find something. I really like learning how to how to file a document. I like that after learning so much, you learn how, like, you can think of a zone and think of what documents go in there and things like that. But I really like the investigative side too, where you can really dig into those problems and issues. And I really like digging in and finding what those problems are and figuring that stuff out. So it's kind of similar to what Misty says. It's really nice working those things out and and just working, like she said, puzzles. It's really nice working on being investigated, almost like being a PI or something and looking.
Oh my gosh, I was going to say that. I was literally going to say, it's like, we're not a principal investigator, we're the private
Right.
investigator trying to solve all these problems. And so I think what you both are kind of touching on here kind of leans into the first question that I was going to ask. That's maybe a little bit more targeted to today's conversation, thinking about kind of the competencies, the knowledge that we should have as TMF professionals. And I think I kind of hinted at this when I was talking about, making a career as a TMF professional. And, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, being a TMF professional was really just kind of reviewing documents, right? It's kind of what comes in, we review them, we place them in the TMF, oftentimes in those wonderful paper TMFs. That's what Misty and I started with way back in the day. And so it's really changed. The landscape has changed as technology has evolved. We have eTMFs, we have electronic signatures, direct document authoring within platforms. So with this kind of like change in the industry, I know you both have been here for quite a bit, what's maybe kind of the mindset, the frame of mind, kind of a core competency or skill that comes to mind for the two of you? And I think we've kind of touched on, maybe it's like being investigative or being someone who can operate within a structured environment, and you can expand on those here or come up with a different one to share. But what are you thinking is maybe that kind of key competency that sticks out to you in your career and what you're seeing? And either one of you feel free to kind of take that one.
Well,
go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I heard Misty first. We'll go with Misty.
This is actually kind of funny because I said that I like structure, but I also think a big part of being successful in the TMF industry or space is flexibility too. Since I started, I mean, from day one, as you remember, Ben, we were talking about change. We were talking about what's going to happen when we take this electronic, and then we did. And then it's like, well, what's going to happen when this gets more standardized and everybody starts using it? And then that happened. And that's pretty much constant, but that's a beautiful thing as well. And so being able to understand the structure and keep it structured, but also sort of bend and move with the technology as it becomes available is really important as well.
Yeah, I like that. It's maybe touching on kind of being like a lifelong learner in a way. So that competency is like, being adaptable, being able to kind of learn new skills, learn new technology, because it has changed, right? We still see some paper, despite our best efforts there. But I do like that. So yeah, Jen, what are you thinking over there? What's something that jumps out to you as kind of a key skill or competency that we need to have?
I hate to repeat what she said, but I think change management is really important. You have to be able to deal with changing regulatory, but you also, like, in TMF, you often, some people will work in the same structure all the time, but if you're working, you may be working in different structures, different eTMF platforms, you're working on different protocols. You have to be able to adapt to those things and kind of dig in and learn about each study that you're assigned to or things like that, so that you can learn the protocol, things like that. I mean, I think it's like you said, it's like that curiousness and wanting to know more and understanding the entire process of like how a drug goes to trial and how the clinical process works. So I think change management for all the changes, for so many ways that it could be, whether you're working for a sponsor or as a consultant, or a CRO.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm very appreciative because I think one of the core skill sets of a TMF professional is, document quality review, right? Like that eye for detail. But I'm glad that neither of you really mentioned that as a key competency, because I think that speaks to the growth that we've seen of TMF professionals. We're not just individuals who are looking at documents, right? We're not just reviewing for document quality anymore. I still think that is a core skill set to have, but it's not the only one. So for those of you kind of listening in, we've seen this kind of change management mindset, this lifelong learner mindset that we need to have, because the TMF space does evolve. A lot of the general concepts are the same, timeliness, quality, completeness, what we hear all the time, but how we're managing those is very different. So we have to be quite adaptable there. And I think for me, one thing I always like to kind of mention is, as a TMF professional, one of the skills that you really have to have is being able to like advocate for yourself and your department. So kind of being strong-minded in a way, because for many years we were looked as like the yes people, like, oh, they're going to do this. Yes, we will. And we've now kind of found the balance of what are functional lines responsible for, what are we responsible for. So we really have to have that voice for our own department. And I think that's very important for all TMF professionals, is to kind of understand what is our responsibility, right? So I know that's kind of a loaded statement to say the competency is really kind of understanding what the TMF space is and what a TMF management team should be doing and the role that we play, right? When do we push back? When do we not push back? So lots of great thoughts there. And again, document quality, it's always going to be there, but it's not the only thing that we do. So I'm glad that you both kind of mentioned other stuff.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's kind of keep talking here. And again, questions, comments, if you have them, put them in. We'll certainly address those. I see some folks glad to see us. We're good to see you guys. Glad to see you guys as well. So have those come in at any time if we're making comments and you're like, I want to speak to that. Or sometimes, people say, oh my gosh, I agree. Sometimes it's just good to kind of commiserate together, right? And say, yeah, these things are tough for us. But let's kind of keep moving here and talk about, regulatory expectations and managing those expectations as a TMF professional, because as we know, there's a ton, right? There's not just the FDA, there's beyond the FDA, the MHRA, PMDA, Health Canada. We could go on and on. I'm not trying to say any of those are more important than any other regulatory agency that's out there. But there's global expectations for the way in which clinical trials need to be facilitated. So considering this, right, there's lots of expectations. Something that I'm asked and that's talked about is, how do you remember all of these regulations and how do you keep them in mind in day-to-day practice, and how do you not violate these regulations? So, maybe Jen, I'll let you start this one off then. Do you know all the regulations out there? Like, do you have them memorized? Do you think it's possible for us to kind of know all of the regulations that exist for managing the TMF globally?
I think that's a great question. It's not the easiest thing to remember so many regulations. I think we do remember some of the main ones, the main core thoughts around that. I think if you work with documents enough, you are able to understand most of them. Can I read you the federal, the code of regulations? Probably not, but I know the basic rules behind there. I think keeping up with those things, you can often, have references to certain documents and websites so that you understand what they are. If you have questions and you can't remember a certain thing, then you can refer back to them. But I think working every day with these regulations, we end up getting so comfortable that we do remember them. And I think it's just an important point that sometimes you just need to go in, and especially when there's changes or something, go in and just refresh yourself with memories. But I think, like I said, I can't read the code of regulations to you, but I mean, I have a basic understanding of them, and doing some type of training on those things, at the beginning to get that fundamental background is probably really important, I would say.
Yeah, no, I like that. MSC, what do you think in that same topic? Do you agree, disagree? Where are you falling?
I completely agree. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that we could memorize all of them. In a similar way that a lawyer doesn't remember every single law, but they know where to go. So it's about knowing your resources. Mm-hmm. So if you don't know, you could be looking at something and get an idea that this might be wrong. So you know where to go and check. And that's a big part of being a TMF professional in general, is knowing your resources, because, you know, as much as we try, and like Jen said, some of it does become just a fundamental part of your everyday job. And there's things that you do know right away. There are going to be times when you need to go to those resources. So I think it's just more important to expect yourself to know your resources than to try and memorize everything.
Yeah, no, I certainly appreciate that mindset. And so you all have heard it here first. It's highly unlikely that we will have all regulation memorized, right? And I think that can be paralyzing for some people. To maybe expand on this topic a little bit, is because there is this intense pressure as an industry, right, to meet regulatory expectations and to be inspection ready. And part of inspection readiness is complying with what those regulatory standards are. And so I think the thought kind of becomes, well, I kind of have to know everything, right? You know, even as an educator in this space, there are times where there are very specific questions that are asked that are quite nuanced. That's kind of like, whew, okay, let me go to Misty's point. Let me go to that resource, right? And to kind of what Jen was saying, you can pull into what you're familiar with, what you do know, but there are going to be times where you're stumped, you're unsure. And again, to what Misty was saying is, as a TMF professional, it's important to understand, where are my resources? What am I going to be looking at? Going to the regulations specifically, not just trusting, you know, a Google answer or a Chat GPT or other AI source that you might be using. It's actually going to that regulation itself and kind of understanding what that expectation is. But to kind of expand on that a little bit, right? So we know that regulatory guidance exists, and we know there are expectations of us, you know, from a timeliness perspective, from a quality perspective, from a completeness perspective. So when we maybe put that within the parameters of being a TMF professional, and maybe we can start with like quality, and talk about, you know, regulatory agencies typically expect all documents to be complete, to be accurate, you know, everything to be signed that's required, all of the information to accurately represent kind of the events of that trial. So as a TMF professional, you know, how do you meet that expectation? What competencies do you think you need to have to kind of meet those regulatory requirements, or allow your organization to meet those regulatory requirements of quality? So what are some of the things that come to mind for you in that kind of space as a TMF professional?
Donuts, I'll jump on that one. Can you repeat? I just want to make sure you repeat the question so I understand it properly.
Yeah. Yeah. So from a quality perspective, and the regulatory expectation for the TMF to demonstrate that, or the documents filed in the TMF to be of the appropriate quality, as a TMF professional, like, what role do we play in that quality perspective? What do we need to know as TMF professionals as it relates to quality? Like, what are some of the things that stick out to you? What are you looking for? What's kind of in your toolkit, common problems, things like that?
The first things you should, I mean, I think this is what you're looking for, but things like the Alcoa principles, attributable, and all those things. Are you thinking of that?
Yep.
Like, per document?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so we're looking for things like, is it attributable, legible, or, you know, is everything filled in properly? So following Alcoa Plus is important, because you want to make sure the document itself is ready for the TMF and ready to be filed in its official capacity. So you want to make sure all those little boxes are ticked, or required signatures are filled in, like legibility. If there's certain sections that have to be completed, they should be completed or marked, you know, that they don't need to be that. Again, Alcoa principles are important, but then you can follow, like, even having your own set of like checklists for quality. You can also have that for document quality and things like that. So when you're looking at the document itself, you want to make sure it's technically ready, ready for consumption, and to be saved and indexed as that final record, and that everything is in line as it should be.
Okay. Yeah, I like that, Jen. I think I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here, because we're talking about quality. We've talked about Alcoa. You've kind of given some examples of what we're looking for. You know, there may be people who are like, wow, well, how does Jen know this? You know, and we've kind of talked about the regulatory sets the expectation, right? And then Jen's kind of routed off all of these things that we're looking for. But maybe, Jen, this is a reflection of your own career as even as a line manager, maybe you've worked with folks, how are people learning how to do this, right? Like quality, if you were just to tell someone to review a document for quality, right? How do they create that mental checklist? How do they know what they're looking for? Do you think people kind of bring these skill sets in from like an outside perspective, or do you think it's like a lot of on the job learning for those maybe curious about like, how the heck do I learn about this quality stuff?
I would have to agree that it does come from, it's kind of both, where they come in somewhat already knowing and having possibly used the Alcoa principles, but it's also the more you work with them, the more you're going to understand them. So I think the best way to do that is, I mean, really just to have a good training program for those who come in, so that when they, when someone comes in, there is an expectation that they have certain skills and things like that, but knowing those principles is important. But if you don't have those already, it's important to train on those and to train the people that, so either you need to train on them or you need to train the people that work for you how to understand those Alcoa principles. And I think having, whether it's a small training at the beginning, just to assess how somebody understands it. And again, it's just another one where the more you use it, the more you're going to remember. And it's almost like you won't have to, use a checklist. But you could make a checklist out of it, so that when someone's starting out with reviewing documents, whether it's indexing or quality reviews, you can always go through the checklist to make sure you're checking on all those items. I think that's a good way to get people used to it, because it gets to be to a point where you have a checklist, and then after you've looked at 100 documents, going down the checklist, you somewhat remember those items that you have to look for the next document.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, again, it's just kind of reassuring folks that might be listening in that are curious about the TMF space, or maybe they're going to make the switch over from like, maybe they're going to go CRA to TMF, right? I think a lot of us, that was my mindset when I started in the industry. I was like, I want to be a CRA. I honestly, sorry to the CRAs out there. I thought it was just like fun travel. And I realized that it's not fun travel, and it's a lot of responsibility. And I was like, I don't know if my brain is wired that way. And then we've got some questions coming in the comments here if we want to kind of take a look at some of those, because again, the intent here is to really answer the questions that you all have. So kind of Lisa said, is there a validation process you suggest for trial milestones to know the TMF is inspection ready at any time? So I think this is kind of a nice topic as it relates to kind of the timeliness aspect of regulatory requirements, or if we want to use the fancy word, the contemporaneousness of the trial master file. So when we think about here, kind of break this question down, having a process in place for milestones to know that the TMF is inspection ready. So I'll kind of we'll break this question down over multiple parts. And so I'll kind of say, Misty, kind of toss you the question here. With knowing expected documents and knowing our TMF index, and you don't have to give a long answer here, do you think it's commonly understood that documents come in at different times, right? Based on what's going on in the, what's going on at the study at this given time. So documents aren't always expected at the same time. Do you kind of agree with that one?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Cool. So we kind of established that baseline here, Lisa's question, that, documents come in at different times. Your index could say you expect a site initiation visit report and you expect a closeout visit report, but we don't often expect those to happen at the same time, right? I'm sure crazier things have happened and a site's been initiated and closed within a week. I'm sure it's out there, people. There's always exceptions to the rule. But what do you all think? So maybe as a TMF professional here, how are you supporting maybe milestone, capturing milestones, or ensuring that documents are filed at those expected milestones, or even when events happen? What have y'all maybe done in your career? Are you leveraging technology? Are we using trackers? What do we think there? Like, how are we ensuring completeness of the TMF at all times? And kind of from the perspective of a TMF professional, what are you doing to make sure that happens?
So in my experience, we have just made sure that there's a constant, not a constant, but a regularly scheduled review of the TMF. And again, the milestones play a big part in that, because when if you're looking at the beginning of a study, you're not expecting those documents from the last subject, last visit aren't going to be there. So you're looking for the documents that are at the latest milestone that you've passed. So let's say you've had site initiation, there are certain things you would expect at site initiation or once, even after the first visit, there's certain things there's certain activities that will be triggered by those milestones. So, after your first site visit, let's say, that's going to contribute, you need to be looking at certain things from that milestone, like site setup documents and those types of things. So they're very important, because then you might get to a point where you're doing, it might be the last subject last visit. So you're getting closer to, you might need a lot more documents at that point. So looking at documents that are expected at certain milestones is very important. You can do that with a checklist. You can do it with, you're going to have frequent document QCs. You can have a checklist. You can use expected document lists, electronic lists in the system to manage your placeholder or manage documents as they come in. So there's a lot of good ways to trace them, but the milestone is very important by thinking of what documents are expected at this milestone. And, we're not going to worry about the ones that aren't necessarily expected now. Not that we don't worry about them, but if they're not expected, we're not going to consider that a finding or a problem.
Yeah. And Misty, let me ask you just maybe a yes or no question here. Do you have experience with like tracking those milestones in EDLs, like in a system or in a tracker?
Yes, I've experienced with both. And I think, do you mind if I expand?
Yeah, go. I was gonna say the only thing, if with that experience, what is the role that you're playing, and what are the roles that maybe those functional lines are playing? If you want to maybe touch on both of those.
Sure. So now in the role that I'm in now, it's really more with the checklist, noticing if something is missing or what have you, and then reaching out to the functional list, because I don't have access to get what's missing myself. So I have to reach out to those that do. And as far as the exact process for that, I think that as long as there is a process that everyone with your group is aware of, that's what's most important. As rather than a specific one that I would recommend. Because like I said, I've worked with lots of different ways of doing it. And as long as there is one that everyone is aware of, I think that's what counts.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a key topic there, is kind of this collaboration in a way, or kind of this mutual understanding of the responsibilities. Because one of my favorite things, it's my favorite and least favorite thing about TMF management, is that the way I kind of talk to people about regulatory expectations is they give, and Nicole said great point, Missy, I just want to acknowledge that. And Sue had mentioned using trackers is a big help. So loving kind of the engagement there. Hopefully people are seeing kind of some of the comments come in too as responses. But when we think about kind of the TMF and regulation, the regulation is the goal, right, of where we want to be, but how we get there from organization to organization is drastically different. I always make the joke, some of us are walking, some of us are jogging, some of us are on a bike, some of us are in an airplane, and we get there faster in different ways, and that's okay. So there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do something, but I think, Misty, you kind of touched on that important point of reaching out to the appropriate folks, communicating with the right people to get those answers. Because I think what Misty and Jen and I have kind of all acknowledged today is that even as a TMF professional, we understand where our expertise lies, and we also understand where the collaboration is needed. And that's another topic we'll be talking about this week, is when to pull in those functional lines so we can manage this. Because if we're not being communicated with to know that a protocol amendment happened, or that there's been a change to the trial design and there's now a new ICF that's required, or a form or shipping that's required, or we have moved, lab vendors. If this isn't communicated, we can't really coordinate those expected document lists and milestones. So the biggest thing is kind of that collaboration between your TMF team and your functional lines, and keeping those windows open. Jen, you kind of mentioned regular reviews. That's going to create those communication lines. So again, it's ongoing management is the biggest thing. You need to look at them consistently, and then communicate and collaborate are the big ones there. So
agree. And like have a process ready of how you are going to handle those things. Working on a process is an important thing too for each, for your different, whether it's for a functional line or for other groups or the entire study team. I think having that process documented is a good idea too.
Yeah. No, I love that. And then I think this comment comes from the Alcoa principles that was mentioned earlier. I was kind of monitoring the chat, and I think when we were chatting about this topic, Jen, you had mentioned like the Alcoa principles, something to reference in the TMF plan or quality plan. What are you seeing? So when you think about these kind of quality expectations, right, and maybe creating the checklist or kind of outlining the principles in your careers, where have you seen this documented, or is it being documented? Have you seen the good and the bad? What are y'all thinking there? Like, again, I think the way the question is like those quality expectations, completeness, check boxes, signatures, pagination, all the metadata, legibility. Where are you seeing those expectations documented most often, and where do you prefer to see them maybe in your experience? And maybe Misty, I'll let you take this one first.
I would expect. I think that it could easily belong in both plans. It's so important.
Yes.
And that's genuinely how I feel about it. When I read the question, my first thought was, yes, both. Why not put it in both?
Sure.
And then also as a TMF professional, I feel like I've seen it a whole bunch in my training. Mm-hmm. So I see it there. But the TMF plan I would say 100%. I would expect.
Okay.
That's what I would agree with. Yeah, that's the main place to put it. But again, like you can put it in the TMF plan for, the sponsor or the client or, the project, but, you may also have your own project plan, and those things. I think we sometimes put those in a scope of work even to show you, what our steps are and what we're going to be working on. We often will put that information in there. So, but I think, like you said, it's not a bad thing to have it documented in more than one place, but I think the TMF plan is one of the main places that we would look for that, along with other information.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it kind of comes back to me, the philosophy of if it's not documented, it didn't happen. In this mindset, if it's not documented, it won't happen. So really, to me, when I chat with organizations, I say, ultimately, I don't necessarily care where you put it, so long as it's documented and people are trained on it, so they can't use that excuse of I was never told. Because again, if you tell people, if you just say concept as a quality or quality as a concept, review the quality of the documents, people aren't going to know what that means. So we have to create the structure. So, I mean, Jen, Misty, maybe stay on this point for a second. Have either of you had the experience where you've coordinated kind of creating this checklist or defining these expectations? And how did that go about if either one of you is maybe either updated or created? What's that look like?
Okay.
A lot of times. I don't think any of us have worked at a startup, have we? So it's kind of like, it's a lot of times it's established. And I think for me, when I think about it and creating, I've talked to organizations that are maybe startups, maybe I have a little bit more experience here, quote unquote, in the education space, because we do see a lot of startups or organizations kind of creating these. And the question always becomes, well, what's the starting point? And I think it circles back to what we talked about earlier, is knowing what those regulatory expectations are, like the Alcoa principles, looking into ICH GCP. Again, the great thing is quality is essentially universally agreed on by regulatory agencies. There's not really any contradicting expectations of this, it must be said this way versus it must be said that way, or quality must be looked at for these 5 things. And another says, no, you can't inspect that. So citing your regulation is going to be one of the biggest helps there. But yeah, documenting it, TMF plan, work instructions, SOWs, anything to just kind of get that at the forefront is going to be your best friend. Also, go for it. Was that Misty or Jen?
I was just going to say it may be in your SOPs too. I mean, make sure that
exactly
would have that built in, and just knowing all of those. And that's one of the things I would have said.
I love it. Yeah, I like it in the TMF plan. I see another questions come up. I like it in the TMF plan because people train on TMF plans, or should train on TMF plans more often than their SOPs, because you might do your SOPs every year, 18 months, whatever your cycle is. But if you roll on to new studies, hopefully you're requiring all of your team members to train on that TMF plan, so they're constantly exposed to that kind of quality expectation. I love it. I did want to acknowledge, somebody else also said we all fell for the CRA coolness. It is a cool career. I have several friends that are CRAs. It is. It's just not the cool career for me. So All right, so we see here, can we talk about timeliness metrics? And I know we kind of have a section, or we had a comment ourselves when we were planning to talk about metrics and oversight, so this is great. Can you please explain about timeliness metrics? How do we ensure that our TMF is in a compliant manner for timeliness or contemporaneousness? Because regulatory agencies are expecting real-time availability of essential documents. So let's kind of start with the end of that question. So I want to maybe see both of your experiences here, and kind of understanding what timeliness is. So, Jen, Misty, in audits and inspections, when have you start to see timeliness be a problem? Because this real-time expectation, right? A lot of people think immediate, but in my experience, if a document's filed 5 days, 2 weeks after it's finalized, we haven't gotten much pushback. But when have y'all started to see maybe some pushback on what took so long for this record to get in? Does anything like a story stick out to you, or kind of any experiences stick out related to timeliness?
Well, the worst, I have like a horror story, but it's
Go for it.
the paper days.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay.
And there was a CRA that was essentially just, maybe it was a project, it doesn't matter. There was someone who was essentially just like hoarding their documents because I guess sending them down to the file room was too hard. And then they left the company, and in their desk when they left, like piles of documents were found.
Oh my goodness.
Piles. That then became someone else's problem because they had left the company. And that was definitely an issue. There were notes to files that had to be written because some of the documents had issues, but they were like years old. And so getting any corrections made was impossible. It was quite a fun time to get it all sorted in the right place. And then also, like I said, explanations in place. Now in that case, I guess we weren't specifically in an audit, but we had to be prepared to answer questions if the audit came about, like, this document was missing signatures, and like a training log or something is missing all these signatures. And yeah, we can't get them because 2 of those employees don't work there anymore because the document itself was a year old when we got it. You either have to have something in the file explaining it, or you got to be ready to explain it when they ask. So it was great.
Yeah, and I like that. And Jen, seems like you want to add to that, so go for it.
And it's really setting your own expectations. And I mean, obviously, that's something when you have the paper TMF, and most people know that there is a timeliness, when it should be filed, and setting those expectations at the startup is important, and just being realistic as well. Like you said, immediate is nice, but I mean, you have to give those who are inspecting those documents or reviewing those documents the time to look at them, depending on the quality, the quantity that you're getting in, and what kind of quality is it? Does everything have to be completed? What else needs to be looked at? So, I mean, it's having that timeline at the beginning. I think regulatory, they usually have a set timeline. I don't know if it's 30 days to put a document in, but being realistic. I mean, there are clients that we've had that have said, we want this document in within 7 days. I mean, in some cases you can do that, but you need to look at those and look at the numbers of it. Is that realistic? Look at what the metrics come out. If you start with that point and say, can we really sustain this based on the size of the study and the number of documents that are coming in and the number of people that are assigned, just things like that. So you do have to keep those things in mind and establish those should be part of your SOPs anyway, and your plan possibly. So make sure that those are well documented, so it's an achievable goal to be able to get those documents in 7 days, if that's what you want to set it at. So things like that.
Yeah. And so, Jen, maybe to elaborate on that. So when we think about the timeliness of documentation, it's kind of a conflicting thing, right? Because as like maybe TMF manager, we're responsible large scale for the health of the TMF, right? We're kind of the keepers of the TMF health, the oversight there. But a lot of our functional lines, we're dependent on them filing the documents, right? So the completeness of the TMF, the timeliness of the TMF is dependent on them taking that document from whatever system they created in and getting it into the TMF. So, as a TMF professional, and Misty, feel free to speak here as well. I'm just kind of continuing Jen's point. How do we, or what do we need to be doing as a TMF professional from a timeliness perspective? Like, do you think that's really on the responsibility of the project team only, those functional lines, or do TMF professionals need to step in and have some level of oversight and accountability? What are y'all thinking there?
I think that especially with the technology we have available, there's room for the TMF professionals to help with that. We can't get the documents, but we can certainly use, metrics and dashboards and things of that nature at our disposal to go, hey, these things appear to be missing. Mm-hmm. Can you get those, please? Because if not, this is the percentage that your TMF is at, and it's not pretty, or or what have you. Or we can send the hey, we checked it and everything's perfect message, but I don't get to send those as often.
I know we do need to acknowledge the good as well. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think, this kind of centers on like the competency of, like communication and being an effective communicator, also being able to like analyze data and interpret data. That's a big piece as well, because oftentimes, kind of as Misty mentioned, we may be generating the reports, but now we have to communicate that in a way that's easy for others to understand. Because if I just sent out an EDL report that showed like 0 documents versus like 2 expected, people probably wouldn't understand what that meant. So how do we, change the data, I think is important. And the other thing from a timeliness perspective, just to add on, I know we've got a couple other questions that have come in just a few minutes. With measuring timeliness, that's often the difficult expectation. So as Jen mentioned, you kind of have to create the timeline, whether it's 7 days, 10 days, 30 days, whatever you might create. But then how do you leverage technology to measure that? So are you using metadata to capture those like document creation or collection dates, and then you can generate a report that shows the day it was in the system? Otherwise, you may not know, like a medical license. It may be from April, or I wouldn't even say April, January of this year, but it was filed today. Well, if the site was just activated, that makes sense, right? But if you run a report that says document date, which is maybe January, because that's when it was like effective, versus today's filing date, you may say, oh my gosh, it took 8 months. That's way too long. So you got to have that critical thinking skill as a TMF professional to really dissect the information you're looking at, but leverage your technology there from the timeliness perspective.
And even, sorry, I was just going to say regularly scheduled metrics. If you have your reports come out once a week, once a month, or, at certain times that it's going to matter, then you can monitor that a lot better if you do set those times for those metric reports to come to you so that you can, remember to frequently look at those things.
Yeah, I love that. Loaded question here. I might take this one because I know we still have a little bit of time here. So I think we're actually good, but I may lead this one just because I love the archiving stuff, and Misty and Jen, feel free to add here. So can you touch base on archiving the TMF and when an archive should be completed? And I think this is interesting if we think from like the mindset of a TMF professional, the role that we play. It's that oversight piece that we've kind of mentioned quite a few times now. Today is that communication with project teams. So you do want to establish timelines, and it might be different depending whether you're a sponsor organization, whether you're a CRO, the type of trial, the phase, all of those things could impact the final study deliverables. But in my experience, a lot of what we try to or the milestone that we tried to work off of was the final site's closeout visit, because that's essentially, and I think I see Jen and Misty maybe nodding, and maybe somewhat of agreement there, or maybe they're just like me and I tend to nod and say okay to people as they chat, just to acknowledge I'm paying attention. I think for me that tends to be kind of a key milestone, because you've wrapped up a lot of the key deliverables at that point, a lot of the site activity, or should be done at that point, hopefully, if you're at the last COV. And then you can usually project around like 8 weeks from that point to have all activities wrapped up. That's inclusive of like final QCs that need to happen, remediation of any outstanding issues. You should have been working on that throughout kind of that closeout period, but we know things linger and there's things that we need to follow up on. But typically I'd say like that 6 to 8 weeks from the final site COV. Obviously it's dependent on final reports that need to be available, the timelines for those. But what I tell people is you need to keep things fresh, because if you're only waiting on like the CSR or like a couple other minor deliverables that don't impact a lot of these other functional lines, they're kind of off the study, right? They've moved on to their next project. And once they're gone, it's really hard to get them back to resolve quality issues for this study. So you need to prioritize addressing all of your issues as close to those final milestones as possible, so that when you have that final deliverable for the study, whatever it might be, you kind of can just plug that in, review it. You know, your TMF is in a good spot. The EDL has been managed. It's been, finalized, and then you can kind of move on from there. So that's kind of the timeline I see. Misty, Jen, I don't know if you have different experiences there, because again, it's different from organization to organization. It can be different from study to study, but creating the baseline is what's most important, so that people know, okay, COV 8 weeks is kind of the maximum that we have here to wrap all this stuff up. But what are y'all seeing? Have y'all had different perspectives?
I've seen the same. I was going to say, though, to some degree, I like to think of it as you're like rolling archival. Like when some sites close out earlier on, you should be working, like when a site closes, let's wrap that up. Let's get that one ready for archival, and always kind of be doing that. So like you were saying, when we're getting to the very end, it's 8 weeks, but you should kind of be doing it the whole time. Not necessarily in startup, but once you hit like a maintenance area, you should kind of be in that mindset the whole time. I need this to be ready for closing. And it will make it so much easier.
Yeah, I love it.
And I think being in contact with your CRAs and your study, or, your study team about, where they are, I think that's important too, is having that contact where, this one, this site's going to be closing, or this one has, just being in that constant contact. And then towards the end, it gets to be where you're really chasing those few documents and things like that. So it's really just keeping that constant, or that, frequent contact, understanding where we are with what we have left.
Yeah, I love that. And Jen and Misty, I think you both have touched on this point several times, but we maybe haven't directly addressed it. And it's the proactive nature that TMF management needs to have now, I think. And you may disagree, but I think when I started as a TMF professional, we were very reactionary, or we were like a reactive role. It's like, oh, documents came in, I need to file them. Okay, you put a sticky note, I'm sure, Misty, you recall these, on the files. Okay, I need to move it, I need to remove it, I need to make this change. We were kind of told what to do a lot of times. And I think we're now finding that balance of where we lead in communication. So sending out those advance notice of an upcoming milestone, like, hey, these are the documents they need to be filed before these milestones, or this milestone has passed, these documents are still missing. Where are they? Kind of following up on those things. So again, just making sure we have that proactive communication, so we can have that rolling closeout and archival process. Because I often say it's much easier to kind of move yourself. I say 5 feet, but I'm like, okay, 5 meters might be better understood globally. 5 meters today than it is to try to run a marathon in 6 months, right? Like if somebody asked me to just drop today and run a marathon, I'd probably say, how much money are you going to pay me? Versus, if they said, hey, can you like walk to the other side of your house? I'd be like, yeah, I could probably move to the other side of your house. I could probably do that today. So that's the mindset to have there. Let's see here. And again, if you guys have specific questions, stay engaged with us. Ask on LinkedIn. We'll follow up on some of these. I've seen kind of a few rolling questions come through, and just being mindful of everyone's time. I do want to make sure that we capture everything. I know we can stay on for a little bit longer here, but the KPIs on your TMF project. So do you run? So I'll say this, maybe I'm going to rephrase this question from Lisa a little bit here, because I know we're running metrics, right? But who is responsible for running metrics in y'all's experience? Like, who typically has oversight of this? Either one of you currently, running metrics, or is it the functional lines? What have you seen? And share the good, the bad, the ugly. What do you think works best here with generating those metrics and KPIs?
In my experience, it's usually a project manager or oversight who's going to run that.
Okay.
If you as a support analyst or that type of TMF person have that capability, you can always run them yourself. But usually, I would see a project manager running them because they're going to be
Okay.
looking at the project as a whole and saying, okay, we got this area, we've got this metrics. What can we do to improve other areas that are falling behind and things like that? That's what I usually see doing it.
Okay.
I don't know if Misty has a different.
No, I agree. That's been my experience as well.
Okay. I love it. Yeah. And I think too, if we think TMF specific metrics, again, if we think about the communication, there may be some that you have your support analyst or TMF manager generate and communicate or collaborate with that project manager, because as Jen mentioned, they often oversee, well, they do oversee the entire project, right? So they're I always say they're not the expert in any of the other functional lines, right? Like they know enough to kind of understand the expectations, but we need to kind of communicate to them what this means. Is this a concern? Is this something they need to kind of be on people about, or can they relax a little bit here? But yeah, metrics should be generated. A lot of the follow-up questions tend to become, well, how often do you generate metrics? And again, just like with all things TMF, it really just depends. Like I, tell people, if you run a quality metric every single day, there may be a day where one document came in and you failed it, so your quality for the day is 0%. Are you going to freak out about that? And again, this is where these kind of competencies come into play, and being able to analyze and review and kind of critically think through what that metric is actually saying. Like, am I going to freak out on somebody because one failed? No, I'm going to look at the bigger picture and see 1 of 100 failed. So we're at 99% quality. So I think that's one of the big things.
Yeah, that's a really important point, that you can have your metrics set up. But until like something does show on the metrics, you might not know that you need to delve deeper. So you can have a set of metrics, but as you go along and something comes up, you'll dig deeper and see, well, what is causing this? What can I do to help this issue? And how can I? So you might have to generate more metrics, but I mean, it's just it's almost like using AI. The more you put in, the better results you're going to get out. So.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's see. Based on experience, you think it's easier to have? A great question. Okay, so outsourcing, this could be its own topic, I think. So this will be a good one here. Based on your experience, do you think it's easier to have a CRO handle the TMF or have it in-house? And I know, at LMK, this is one of the services that we do offer, right? It's kind of this outsourcing of activities. So, I think, Misty, you and I worked at CROs together. Jen, I know you have experience as well, kind of on the other side of things. What do you all think here? Or is it maybe relates to outsourcing? Because TMF professionals exist in all capacities, right? In-house, maybe at a sponsor, outsourced at a CRO, outsourced at a third-party vendor like we are at LMK. Let's kind of maybe, do you think it's easier? Maybe instead of saying, do we think it's easier, what do you think are maybe some of the advantages to perhaps outsourcing as compared to keeping it in-house? So like using a vendor, using that third party, what do you think they bring to the table at times?
Well, being specialists, being trained very specifically, let us take this from you because we know this.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives you a sense of safety when it comes to your TMF, which is so important.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that's the benefit is the expertise that you get from. And that can be true with any kind of vendor. There's a reason that vendor is doing that, and it's because of their knowledge and ability.
Yeah, I like that.
And I think it depends on what the CRO is contracted for versus what like the specialist would be contracted for, because that's the hard part, is coordinating the CRO SOPs with the sponsor SOPs with our SOPs and making sure that we're all following the same process and that it's really, so that's one of the biggest things is coordinating with the CRO and their process. That's a big deal. I mean, I've seen it on both ends where you have a good CRO who's good about uploading their documents. I've seen others that, they don't have the same structure as maybe, or their structure doesn't seem the same as their sponsor, or, they're following their SOPs where we really need to be following the sponsor SOPs first. So things like that are important, is coordinating between the multiple vendors.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, it's kind of a loaded question, right? Do you think it's easier? A lot of times, like, I just want to say kind of, Yes, in a way, because if your organization does not have a TMF management team in place, and this is just kind of me stepping on the soapbox here, and I think we have a couple other questions, but I may take those as kind of homework for myself, and maybe Jen and Misty, and post those as reply comments to folks as we're just wrapping up here. But if you are an organization looking to like bring in-house activities, implement your own eTMF platform as that's becoming more common. And there's this perception that the eTMF is easy, right? Because it's electronic, it has these reports, it has milestones, it has expected document lists. They do. These systems are great these days, right? But it's still a TMF professional or project management or whoever managing these systems, right? Like the EDL is built off of what we tell the system. The reports give us information, but we have to analyze and report them. So maybe in the initial rollout within your organization, outsourcing can be beneficial because you can learn those skills, right? Like you as a sponsor organization can understand what it means to actively manage the trial master file. The biggest thing you have to remember is that even with outsourced activities, you have to demonstrate oversight, right? So it's not just wash your hands of like, okay, LMK is doing this, CRO is doing that, I don't have any responsibility here. You still have to demonstrate oversight. So there's still that layer of like complexity and nuance there. But you can learn, right? LMK, we're highly collaborative. We have, kind of a consulting arm to kind of work with organizations that are looking to bring this in-house, so they can manage just within their SOPs, right? As Jen mentioned, sometimes you have a third-party SOP, you have a CRO SOP, your own SOPs, and how do we make them all work together? So for me, the biggest thing is just being mindful that if we don't have a team in-house, we really need to build that team, because all of the nuances of managing the TMF, you're not just going to have a role like a project manager or a project support specialist or a clinical trial associate or assistant, whatever we want to call those roles. You're not going to be able to successfully add that on to their current job and effectively manage the TMF, right? You're going to have to bring on additional resources to support this, and they need to know the TMF space, and we're not just relying on our eTMF. So I think if we're green, we haven't really managed studies, it probably is easier for now to outsource. But if we get heavily involved, and I'm not saying micromanaging, I'm saying collaborative, communicative, listening, learning from those experts, we can then make those decisions to bring that in-house, right? Or we could have our system in-house, we could use our SOPs, and then we just outsource the document processing, right? Kind of that stuff that, maybe we don't have the resource for, but we've got all the infrastructure in place. We just need somebody to kind of do this document processing or review. So there's lots of ways we can kind of look at what outsourcing and collaboration looks like. I just want to look, I know there's a couple of comments about checklist. I'll follow up on those separately. And I may just round us out kind of with the last question here. Thinking about competencies, staying up to date, right? So we always talk about change and flexibility, and we know regulatory guidance, maybe with the exception of COVID, doesn't really change all that rapidly, right? We hear about these rollouts for, it feels like years, and these kind of whisperings of things are going to change. But until it's officially documented, rolled out, approved, there's not this immediate impact on us, right? We're preparing for it, but it's not yet required. But, how do you stay up to date? How do you stay current? I think a lot of times we can get maybe complacent in our roles. We do the same task maybe quite a bit. So what are the two of you doing in your career, or have you done in your career, that you found beneficial? Conferences, trainings, are you doing things kind of independently on your own? Are you reading anything? Just kind of as a catch-all here. And maybe Misty, I'll start with you on this one.
Well, trainings are important. Most companies are going to have their trainings, but I do like to look at what's available in the industry. Right now, I am in the midst of the TMF University. So, and I'm enjoying that. And that's been really huge, but, building relationships too, so that people can tell you what else is, people within the industry can keep you abreast of what's going on and be like, hey, this was really interesting. Check that out, whether it be something that you're reading or, a webinar that was available to participate in, things like that.
Okay. I love it. Jen, what about you? What are you thinking?
I would say things like, I follow like bio is it biospace, or different newsletters you can follow about things that are going on in the industry. You can do that. Following things like you can follow the FDA and occasionally take a look at, their sites, or they'll tell you when something new is coming often, or even the TMF reference model. If there are things and changes coming up, they'll often let you know. But it's having some of those connections and checking with them frequently, especially if you see something, that doesn't look right to you and it seems different than it used to be. And you think, oh, did something come out? Did we, so keeping tabs on all those different areas are just a good way to just keep reminding yourself, or when something comes up, if something comes up and it's a time when, like I said, when they announce, E6R3 is coming out. So, you want to, keep up with what's going on and what the changes are for that, or a new reference model and things like that. So just keeping up with, as Misty said, keeping up with a lot of the latest and greatest information is a good way to keep looking.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot that's publicly available, right? And I think there is, free information that's out there, webinars. I know LMK Trial Interactive, we try to kind of be a leader there, and kind of talking about some of these like rollouts of either new technology, new processes, new regulatory requirements. So, be that lifelong learner. I know it sounds so silly, but for me, the other thing that I think is very important, and I have thought this even, kind of before I stepped into my current role as like an education facilitator, is that sometimes we need that outside perspective, that the way that we do things in our organization works, right? Does it? That sometimes we kind of need a pulse check, and maybe we have like an external training that's done. Misty mentioned TMF University, which I'm one of the collaborators there, and one of the facilitators or educators. And it's kind of that pulse check to see, sometimes it's a check. Are we doing things the way we should be doing them? Are there ways that we can change things? And I think that's one of the best things that you can do is continue to check in. Obviously, use your free resources. TMF University is a paid accredited program. We're very proud of it. But we understand that we also need to provide relevant information to folks. So we offer, webinars, there's blogs, even beyond what LMK does. There's plenty of credible spaces that you can access for free. There's the regulatory agency websites themselves, newsletters. You can sign up for those. Sometimes they're technical and a little boring. It's okay. That's what education is at the end of the day. Sometimes it could be a bit boring, but it is necessary. So if you have questions, comments about continued learning offerings that we have, if you want to talk to us about kind of outsourcing of activities, educational offerings, we're happy to do so. Remain engaged. I think you'll probably see a banner pop up that has some contact information here in a bit as we're wrapping up our session, or we'll post it on LinkedIn. Either one there. And a few folks, I see comments have come in that we weren't able to get to, which I'm very excited for, the collaboration that we've had today and engagement. We will certainly reach out to all of you. We'll kind of go on that LinkedIn post. We'll provide some follow-up responses there. So just give us a little bit of time. It won't be like right immediate after, but we'll start working on those in the coming day or two, and remain engaged, right? If you see that post kind of growing, have back and forth comments, you can reach out to us. There's the hello at LMK. We've got day 2 coming tomorrow, talking about confidence and how we talked about the skills today, right? We talked about like owning the TMF, collaboration. Well, how do we build that confidence, right? Because we were so reactive and passive for years. How do we become like proactive and, really reach out? So more to come this week. You're welcome to attend. Thank you for those that were able to attend today. Misty, Jen, fantastic job fielding the questions. I love the engagement. Hopefully for day 2, for our next crew, we'll have just as many questions and comments, but we'll get to those of you that have asked on LinkedIn. Otherwise, just really appreciate everyone's time, and everybody enjoy the rest of their week. Thanks, Misty. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.